Hey, what's up folks? I'm International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and today I'll be doing the recap video for the 2020 US Women's Championship. So the tournament was won by Grandmaster Irina Krush with 8.5 out of 11. She ended up doing really well in the final half of the tournament and playing some really good chess. And this was actually her 8th national title victory, so huge score there for Irina. And it's actually the first title she's won in several years, as the field has only gotten stronger and stronger in recent events, and the tournament has just gotten tougher and tougher. But she managed to pull it off this time, and I'll be presenting some of her key wins first. She ended up winning her last 3 games of the event. This was an 11 round robin tournament, rapid event. 25 plus 5 was the time control. And this round 9 game against women's GM Tatev Abrahamian was really well played. I think this was one of the best games in the tournament. So Black's last move in this position was this move, knight to d5. I believe queen b6 was the theory here, and Black is supposed to be okay in this line. But this move, knight d5, is definitely a mistake, and Irina ends up punishing it really accurately. Starting with the move knight g5, threatening main and 1 on h7, and forcing Black to defend against this with some kind of weakening move, either f5 or g6. Black plays g6, White takes on d5, Queen takes d5, and now just castles, taking advantage of the pin on the d file and the fact that Black, of course, cannot take on e3. So Black here plays bishop e7, hits the knight on g5, White gains a tempo with bishop c4, queen a5, and now h4. Kind of a multi-purpose move, not just defending the knight on g5, but also using the pawn in the attack, as one day White can definitely consider playing h5 here and trying to take on g6. So Black here takes on e3. This is the one moment where I think Irina definitely could have improved on her play. As they pointed out in the broadcast, f takes e3 here would have been, I think, a much stronger choice than the move played in the game. Bishop takes e3, just opening up the f file and including the rook into the attack. And yeah, the engines just go crazy here for White and say that Black is already just not defending this position. But after bishop takes e3, White kept a big advantage here and ends up playing really well just to convert on her initiative. Queen e2, h6, and here White plays really strong counterattacking move, rook to d5. Queen went back to c7, rook c1, gaining another tempo, knight to c6, and now really fantastic sacrifice, rook takes f5. So the main idea here, as Irina explained after the game, is that on g takes f5, her plan, I believe, was to go queen h5, and threatening queen g6 check with just a very powerful attack. And if Black goes hg here, then her plan was already just to recapture with the h pawn, now threatening the move g6, where Black can't take because of this pin on the diagonal. And this g6 move would be just leading to a really powerful mating attack for White here, with queen h7 mate on the agenda. Now we end up getting this position actually by transposition, oddly enough. In the game after rook takes f5, Black decided to take on g5 first, and Irina just very calmly recaptures here hg, with the idea that after g takes f5, Black finally accepting the rook. Now White plays queen h5, and we have the same exact position as before. White is down a full rook, but the attack is just too strong, and Black is completely busted here. Tatev tried queen e5, just getting the queen back to defense. G6, queen g7. Now White has a bunch of wins here. The one they pointed out on the show was really stunning, and it would have been a remarkable way to finish the game. Rook takes c6, b takes c6, removing the defender of the d4 square so that White could play bishop to d4, and illustrating another tactical motive here of deflection, trying to get this queen away from the h7 square so that White can give mate. And yeah, just a total demonstration of the power of the two bishops here, with one bishop helping the attack, the other bishop pinning the f-pawn and not allowing Black to play f6. And yeah, this would have been a fantastic way to end the game. But Irina's way was no less convincing. She went for somewhat simpler bishop to h6. Black played queen f6. She pulls the bishop back to d2, reinstating the threat of queen h7. Black has to go queen to g7, as in all of these lines, if the queen tries to take on g6, of course White would just recapture, and Black would not be able to take this one. So Black played queen g7, and then after bishop c3, it was all over. Black can try to block with pieces on the diagonal, but of course this queen always has to stay tied down to the h7 square. and after bishop takes f6, black would not be able to recapture without getting mated, and thus had to resign. So with this win, Irina actually overtook the lead that was previously being held by Carissa Yip, the recent winner of the 2020 US Girls Junior Championship. Up until this point, round 9, Carissa had actually been leading the tournament. She had overtaken Irina at some point, and in this critical round, Carissa actually lost her game to Ashrita Eswaran, allowing Irina to win this game and leapfrog her in the standings. So that means going into the final day, Carissa Yip was a half point behind Irina, and I believe Dorsa Derek was also just a half point behind Irina going into the final 2 rounds. So it was a really, really exciting final day as both of these players, Carissa and Dorsa, were having good tournaments and very hungry to catch up to Irina. And basically, Irina had to win out her games in order to actually clinch the title. She had to win her final 2 games, and she ended up doing it in really nice style. Her first round of the final day, the penultimate round, was against Sabina Boizor here, and Sabina in this position goes for a pretty sharp sacrifice with knight takes g5. With the point being after hg, rook takes h8, bishop takes h8, queen h5, white has unleashed this kind of pretty unpleasant double attack against the bishop on h8. So white is threatening to win her piece back, but is also threatening to take this pawn on f7 and start attacking black's king. So not an easy position to defend. In fact, Irina here makes a mistake and gives her opponent a chance with this move bishop to f6. This one ends up going unpunished. A stronger move was the just immediate king move, king to d7. A really tough move to play, but it's kind of prophylactic, defending the bishop and also getting out of check in advance. And the point here we can see compared to the game is that the king is just immediately running to c7. So if white castles here, black will play king to c7, and the king is actually reasonably safe, and white won't have enough compensation for the piece. Black would be better. Instead, after bishop f6, Sabina ends up just taking this pawn, and we essentially just get the same kind of position, and black ends up doing well here. But she did have a chance with this move, castles. I thought this was really interesting. Had she found this one, actually, Irina would have been in big trouble, as now that the rook is on the d file, of course, the king can't think of stepping on d7. The knight would move with a devastating discovered attack. And in the meantime, the king is kind of caught on e8. Black can play the move e6 to at least defend the f7 pawn, but then white would follow up with f4. This is, of course, stockfish all the way that I use for this analysis, but apparently this would have been a very, very strong attack. The idea here being that white wants to push e5 and then bring the knight to e4 and one day visit the d6 square or the f6 square. And basically, white would have had a pretty difficult attack for black to deal with here. Instead, after queen takes f7, king d7, black's king looks precarious, but is actually safe. Castles, king to c7. Here, white plays the move knight to b3, unleashing a pretty, again, unpleasant double attack again against the queen on d8, pawn on c5. And here, Irina finds a very accurate, very strong defensive move, knight to e5. Counterattacking the queen on f7, hitting the bishop on c4. If white takes the queen on d8, black will take on f7, and since this rook is still hanging, white doesn't have time to take the knight here, and black would just have an extra piece in the endgame and be winning. So instead, black had to go back with queen to h5, but now queen h8. Black wins another tempo because white just cannot trade queens in this position, has to go back, and black finally uses that key tempo to just defend the c5 pawn, really kill the knight on b3, and now white is essentially run out of compensation. Bishop d5, rook to b8 was played. Black soon played e6, just got all our pieces out, and the game was, it went on for a bit of time, but I think Irina had really good control over this game, and the result was never in doubt. So in order to keep up, Carissa and Dorsa had to win their games. Dorsa was winning, but ended up being held to a draw, so she dropped back a little bit behind. But Carissa had a really crazy game against Anna Zatansky. Anna was not doing well in this event, so she's usually one of the contenders for the title, but this year, yeah, she just didn't perform well in the online format. And even though Carissa was actually worse and pretty much losing the whole game, she kept fighting and eventually reaches this position where she's down in exchange, but has already taken something on h4 and is now kind of threatening to open up White's king and create some counterplay. And this is where the moment where White goes wrong. There were a couple ways for White to essentially win the game. I think this move e5 was strong, as well as throwing in queen b8 check first to cover g3, and then maybe playing e5. But here instead, White ends up going for rook c8 check and taking the pawn on f7. But the issue is that now Black takes on g3 and actually starts creating some real counterplay, threatening to just take on f2 and open up White's king. And in the meantime, White's counterplay with anything like rook to c7 is kind of slow because everything is coming with check. So White takes back the pawn. Carissa starts giving checks, takes his pawn, gives some more checks. And at this point, I think the commentators were expecting Black to take a draw here by Perpetual because she was basically losing the whole game. But the tournament standings kind of dictate that Carissa needed to play for a win here because she's already a half point behind Irina. And I'm not sure if she was keeping an eye on Irina's game or not, but if she was, she would know that Irina is winning at this point. So she was probably thinking that she needs to play for a win at all costs. And here she does it. She just comes up with this very strong move, knight to g4. I think objectively, White is not losing here, but it's a really tough position. And the point is that this queen g8 check that she now allows is just one check. The king will come up to h6. White doesn't have any real counterplay. And in the meantime, Black is threatening a bunch of mating ideas with queen f2, queen h2. Now, I believe the only move here for White to not lose the game on the spot was this move bishop to c4. Very, very tough move to find, especially when you're in heavy time trouble as both players were. The time scramble here was really crazy. There was a lot of mistakes made by both players. White played bishop g2. Of course, understandable with so little time on your clock. You know, no one is going to play like an engine in this situation. But it was really interesting what happened. Black played queen to e3 check, king to h1, and now the stone cold killing move here was queen takes g3, threatening mate on h2. And in case of queen to g1, Black has queen h4 check and is going to be mating in a couple moves here. So this was the killer, but when you're low on time, you know, you have seconds on your clock, you're just relying on this increment. It's really hard to play a move that isn't a check when you have checks in the position. So of course, Carissa plays queen h6 check with queen h2 on the agenda if White goes king g1. So White plays bishop to h3. And now knight e3, a very difficult move to deal with, as White's queen needs to protect the bishop, but the knight hits the queen, covers the g2 square, and all of a sudden White is losing the bishop on h3, it seems. So Anna panicked here. She played this move queen f3, looks natural, but after queen takes h3, king to g1, Black could have already taken the rook here. She misses that. She goes knight g4 instead, but at this point, Black is already completely winning here with 2 pieces for the rook and the raging attack continuing with bishop d4 check, queen h2, and just so many threats in the position. Instead, had Anna had a little bit more time, she might have found basically a really nice defensive resource here. Actually, after any one of these moves, queen g1, queen f2, or queen e2, White could then meet queen takes h3 check with queen h2, blocking and pinning Black's own queen. Meaning that after any one of these moves, when the queen comes to h2, this would actually indirectly defend the rook on c8, as Black's queen is of course pinned to the king. So Black would be forced to trade queens here, and then White would be totally fine. I mean, all 3 results still 100% possible in difficult, you know, nervous time scramble, but objectively White would be quite safe. So kind of unlucky for Anna that she doesn't find this. She ends up putting the queen on f3 and loses the game, but that means that Carissa stays within a half point of Irina going into the final round. Now, the final round, of course, was pretty nerve-wracking. We had Carissa Yip playing against Talia Cervantes and Irina Krush playing against Emily Wynn. So both of the top seeds kind of playing down with White and needing to win their games. I think Carissa was the first one to end up winning her game, and it was a pretty nice and interesting open Sicilian. I want to start from this moment because I think this is where Carissa really takes over. It's a very complicated position. I mean, black has the two bishops, but obviously really vulnerable king. And here white just starts playing against this king, starting with the move e5. The immediate point of this move is that white is actually just opening up the e4 square for the knight. This is a pretty typical idea in these kinds of positions, to open up the e4 square, then the knight would be hitting the queen, but also hitting the g5 square and d6, and really causing a lot of problems. So black plays d5, but now closes up the center. We get more of a French-like structure, and this bishop on c8 immediately becomes a lot less happy. White goes queen to g2, g6, rook h1, really calm but really strong play by Carissa here, just taking over the h-file, preparing to bring her second rook to h1, and playing against black's king. Although in this case, if rook takes h1, since the knight on d4 is hanging, white would probably play queen takes h1 and try to get her queen in on the h-file. Here black played bishop d7, white took on h4, bishop takes h4, queen takes g4, bishop f2, and now again just simple move knight f3, and white is just remaneuvering all of her pieces to the king side. There's a ton of weaknesses there, and any kind of counterplay on the queen side here for black is just not in time. White's attack is a lot stronger. Talia tries to defend here, but white's pieces simply overwhelm, and yeah, Carissa played this part of the game really powerfully. Rook h1, just bringing the rook back. I think rook h2 might have been a little bit stronger, but rook h1 is totally fine. Bishop c6, queen h3, and now black just doesn't have a great defense to white's queen coming in. King f8, knight takes e6, and yeah, this was of course just completely over. Queen h8 check ends the game on the spot. She decided to take queen c8, and black resigned because now losing the bishop on c6 and everything with check, and yeah, game just completely over. So with Carissa winning this game, she was temporarily ahead of Irina in the standings by a half point, and in order to clinch the title, Irina would need to win her game against Emily Wynn. A draw would then lead to some kind of blitz or a rapid playoff. And Irina ends up playing a really nice game here. This comes from an exchange Slav where white gave up her light square bishop on c6 in order to leave black with this weak c-pawn and put some pressure on this pawn, but at the same time, Irina also started advancing on the king side here and ends up causing some grief to black's king. Now at this point, black's position is already pretty difficult. c6 pawn is hanging. White is also preparing to play a move like rook h1, much like in Chris's game, and start taking over the h-file. And here Emily decides to go for this tactic with knight takes g4, which I think is very understandable given that her position is quite difficult. So the point of this one is that white cannot take the bishop on e7, as this would run into knight takes e3 check, forking the king and queen. Instead, white goes f takes g4, black plays bishop takes g5 and wins a pawn, but now black's king has been opened up, and Irina immediately takes advantage. Rook gf1 check, king to e7, and queen to g6 just coming in. She played this part of the game really well. Bishop f6, g5, and now Emily tries to at least make it tricky. Plays rook to g8. White can't take on f6, as after gf the rook will pin the queen and the king. But rook h1, very calm, trying to eliminate black's counterplay. Now the threat is to take on h8, distract one of black's rooks away from the g-file, trade off a rook, and then white would be able, of course, to take on f6. Black plays queen b5, very annoying move, trying to come in with queen to e2. But now again, very cool, calm, and collected. King f3, not just covering the square with the king, but also stepping off of the g-file and reinstating the threat of taking on f6. Black took on h1 here, rook takes h1, rook f8, another tricky move. Once again, white can't take, as she'll lose her queen after rook takes f6. And Irina finds, I think, the absolute only winning move here, king to g3, just stepping off of the f-file, not allowing queen e2 with check, and once again threatening to take the bishop on f6. Well, black tried, I think, the best possible try, just goes queen e2 anyway, and hits this pawn on e3. Irina takes the bishop on f6 with check, and now rook takes f6 was played. G takes f6 here might have been a slightly more annoying move for white to deal with. I think this kind of keeps more chances for black in the position, but white would be winning if she continues accurately here, of course, with something like rook h7 and then queen to g4, just giving up the e3 pawn, but start to run up with the king. And main point here is that queen f2 check is met with queen to g3, and if white can just trade queens here, then it's going to be pretty much all over. Knight can try to come to c5, and we can try to set up mate with rook to d7. So white would have had to really be precise here to win. Against this line, black instead plays rook takes f6, then white takes on g7 here, rook f7, queen g5 check, king to d7. And now white is winning, but of course it's still very, very tricky. And, the pressure of the tournament and the clock, I'm sure, is building up. And black has a lot of very annoying checks threatened with queen f2, queen f3, rook f3 here. So, but Irina was quite precise. She finds knight c5 check, and it turns out that black's king here is just getting mated. Whenever the king goes to the back rank, then white gets to include the rook on the h-file, and after king to c7 here, queen e5 check was played, and king to b6, queen to b8. That was the end of the championship, as only move rook b7, white would play queen takes b7, and it would be mate on the board. So fantastic finish by Irina. She really had to keep her cool there, restricting her opponent's counterplay until the very last second, being very, very accurate with very, very little time on her clock. But she ends up just barely winning the event with 8.5 out of 11. Krista finished with 8 out of 11. And another player who did really well, I want to give a shout out to, is Dorsa Derekshani, who finished with 7.5 out of 11, clear third place. Dorsa in particular surprised a lot of people because she was the 12th seed in the event. So to come in as a 12th seed and end up finishing in third place, yeah, she had I think remarkable event. A ton of nice wins from Dorsa. I want to highlight one from one of the earlier rounds. This was against Anna Zatansky here. And I want to back up a little bit in this game here in a winner where Dorsa started with a really interesting and pretty thematic plan in this position with a4. Just launching the a-pawn up the board, trying to get to a5, opening some lines on the queen side, and also opening up the a3 square for the dark squared bishop. Black here played knight to b8 and tries to get the knight to c6, but white is able to at least open the a-file and castle here. Here, black plays knight to a5, trying to get to the c4 square, and Dorsa unleashes a really strong, really instructive exchange sacrifice. Rook takes a5. And it's kind of a slow burn, but after b takes a5, bishop a3, the compensation becomes pretty clear. White's dark squared bishop is an absolute powerhouse in this position. The rook is coming to b1, and at a certain point, white is going to play c4 and just crack open the position. So king b7 was tried, knight f4, just improving the knight h6, c4, and very nice move, just putting maximum pressure on black center. If d takes c4 here, as is played in the game, white goes rook to b1 check, and now the problem is that if king goes to the corner, of course queen f3 is a huge problem. Black cannot block queen d5 because of the knight. And if the king goes back to somewhere like c8, then just queen f3 anyway, and this queen is coming in, and the white's attack is basically unstoppable. So black was forced to play king to a6 here. Now with the king basically cut off and almost getting mated here, Dorsa finds a really nice move, knight to d3. Basically threatening knight c5, not just forking the king and queen, but just mating the king on the spot. And of course, this comes with the clever point that on c takes d3, white can recapture with the queen and its mate next move. Black played rook to c8 here, knight to c5. Black is forced to give back the exchange. Bishop takes c5. And the incredible thing about this game actually is that I looked it up in the database, and this has actually all been played before in a game by Grandmaster Melik Kachian, good friend of mine, shout out to Melik, 15 years ago in a game in Santa Monica, California. So pretty incredible. This has actually all been played before, and of course white is completely winning here, as black's king on a6 just can't possibly survive. In this game, black plays rook c8. This was the first new move of the game. In the previous game, black tried f4 and of course just ended up getting mated anyway. But after rook c8, white finished things off here with queen c3 and queen to b2, just aligning the queen and rook up on the b file and threatening checkmate on b7. Rook c7 was played, bishop d6. White's attack here just kind of flows very naturally here. D5, nice breakthrough. There are many ways for white to win in this position, but this one is certainly really satisfying as the e-pawn starts chasing black's rook. Rook takes d6, of course, not possible because of queen to b7. Black played c3 here, kind of last-ditch attempt, queen to b8, and here black resigned as there's just too many threats in the position and yeah, no defense. So really nice game by Dorsa, and congrats to her on her incredible third place finish. So up next is the US Championship, which starts on October 26th. That's going to be a really exciting and high level event. I'm very much looking forward to covering that one. And I'll be back here on YouTube for you guys with another recap video at the end of that event. So until then, take care.